Welcome to Mr. Horror. Get ready to be terrified with these true scary sleepover horror stories. Maggie had always been fascinated with the paranormal. She often read ghost stories online and watched horror movies at night. So, when her new friends invited her to a sleepover, she was ecstatic. She couldn't wait to share her love of horror with her new friends. Maggie arrived at the house, greeted by 4 other girls. They were all in their pajamas and ready for a night of giggles and scary stories. They played games, ate pizza, and watched movies until late into the night. Eventually, Maggie suggested they try something different. "Let's try a Ouija board," Maggie said, her eyes bright with excitement. The other girls hesitated but eventually agreed. They sat around the board, their fingers lightly resting on the planchette. At first, nothing happened, and the girls giggled nervously. But then the planchette began to move on its own, spelling out a message. The message was strange and cryptic, and it filled the girls with a sense of dread. They quickly ended the session and went to bed, but Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maggie woke up in the middle of the night, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching her. She sat up in bed and looked around the room, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Suddenly, she heard a noise from outside her door. She cautiously got out of bed and opened the door. No one was there. She shrugged it off and went back to bed. The next night, the girls decided to try the Ouija board again. This time, the messages were more intense and frightening. The board spelled out the name of a young girl who had died in the house years before. Maggie felt a chill run down her spine as the planchette moved on its own. The girls ended the session quickly and went to bed, but Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The following night, the girls were awoken by strange noises coming from the basement. They cautiously made their way downstairs and found the door to the basement was open. As they peered down the stairs, they saw a figure standing at the bottom, watching them. The girls screamed and ran back to their room, locking the door behind them. They spent the rest of the night huddled together, too afraid to go back to sleep. The next morning, the girls were still shaken by the events of the night before. Maggie knew that they had to do something about the haunting, so she did some research online. She found out that the young girl who had died in the house had been buried in the backyard. Maggie convinced the girls to perform a ritual to put the girl's spirit to rest. They went outside and dug up the spot where the girl had been buried. As they dug, they found a small metal box. Inside was a note from the girl's parents explaining that they had performed a similar ritual when she died. The note warned that if the ritual wasn't performed every year, the girl's spirit would return to haunt the house. The girls performed the ritual and the haunting stopped. But Maggie had learned her lesson. She realized that playing with the paranormal had consequences and that sometimes it was best to leave well enough alone. From that night on, she vowed to stick to watching horror movies and reading ghost stories and to leave the real-life ghost hunting to someone else. It was a typical sleepover for Sarah and her 3 friends, filled with gossip, snacks, and scary stories. They had all settled down in their sleeping bags in the living room, ready to drift off to sleep. However, as the night went on, strange things started happening. Sarah heard footsteps in the hallway, but when she looked, no one was there. Later, her friend Abby claimed that someone was watching her from the window, but when they checked, the yard was empty. As the hours passed, the girls couldn't shake off the feeling that they were being watched. Finally, Sarah decided to investigate. She crept quietly into the kitchen and flipped on the light switch. What she saw made her scream. The walls were covered in what looked like blood, with strange symbols drawn in it. Her friends rushed in, and they all saw it too. They knew then that they had to get out of the house as quickly as possible. The girls quickly gathered their things and fled from the house. They ran down the street, not stopping until they reached the nearest gas station. They called the police, and when they arrived, they searched the house. However, there was no sign of anyone having broken in, and the strange symbols on the walls had vanished. Despite this, Sarah and her friends couldn't shake off the feeling that they were still being watched. They stayed up all night, too afraid to close their eyes, until the sun finally rose. Over the next few weeks, the girls tried to put the incident behind them, but it continued to haunt them. They began having nightmares and strange occurrences, such as objects moving on their own or doors opening and closing by themselves. One night, Sarah woke up to find a figure standing at the end of her bed. She couldn't make out any features, but she could sense that it was malevolent. The figure began to move closer and Sarah tried to scream, but no sound came out. She could feel it reaching out to touch her, and just as it was about to make contact, the figure vanished into thin air. After that night, Sarah and her friends refused to ever have a sleepover again. They never spoke of the incident, but it continued to haunt them for years to come. Sarah eventually moved away and lost touch with her friends, but she never forgot that terrifying sleepover and the malevolent presence that still lingered in her memories. I was a teenager when I had my first sleepover with a group of friends. It was exciting. We had stayed up all night playing video games, eating junk food, and sharing spooky stories. But it wasn't until we decided to play with a Ouija board that things started to get really creepy. We set up the board in the middle of the room, and after a few minutes of trying, we finally made contact with something. At first, it seemed like harmless fun, but then the messages on the board started to become more and more sinister. It felt like the room was getting colder and a strange force seemed to be pushing against us. We all agreed to stop playing and went to bed, but that was just the beginning of a truly terrifying night. I couldn't sleep after the Ouija board incident, and I could tell that my friends were feeling the same way. But it wasn't until we heard footsteps in the hallway that we really started to panic. At first, we thought it was one of our parents checking on us, but when the footsteps got closer, we realized that it was something else entirely. We heard a scratching at the door, and then it slowly creaked open. We could see a dark figure standing in the doorway, and it felt like it was staring right at us. We all screamed and huddled together, but when we turned on the lights, there was no one there. After that night, I never wanted to have another sleepover again. But one of my friends convinced me to give it another try. We all agreed that we wouldn't play with any creepy toys or try to scare each other, but it wasn't long before things started to get weird again. One of my friends woke up in the middle of the night, convinced that she could hear whispering voices coming from the closet. When we opened the door, we found a strange, old book inside. It was written in a language that none of us could understand, but as soon as we started reading it, the same dark energy from the Ouija board night seemed to come back. It felt like we were being watched, and I knew that something was coming for us. We all ran out of the room, but I could feel the cold breath of something on my neck as we left. I never had a sleepover again after that. We hope you enjoyed these bone-chilling, true scary sleepover horror stories. It's a stark reminder that even the most innocent of events can turn into a nightmare. Remember to always be aware of your surroundings and never let your guard down. If you have any terrifying experiences of your own, please share them in the comments below. And as always, stay tuned for more spine-tingling stories from Mr. Horror.